Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Reinvent Legal Business Series number 2. As you know, if you've joined others of this series, we're exploring from a global perspective new themes that have emerged and those that have changed or expanded in our legal ecosystem. We're offering these sessions as webinars and also as podcasts as part of our Legalpreneurs Sandbox podcast series. So at your convenience, you can watch or listen to them. Today, we're discussing New World, New Lawyers, how are capabilities shaping up? We're going to be exploring things like different lawyer capabilities. We're going to go through a whole bunch of different shapes and discuss those. We're also going to be looking at changes in the legal ecosystem and how that's impacting legal education and the important role of collaboration and developing lawyer capabilities, and I'm sure much, much, much more. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves and also chat a little about their work in more detail next. So I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail, except to say a huge welcome to Kat Moon coming to us from the US and to Dan Kayne coming to us from the UK. Hi, Kat and Dan. Good to have you.
Hi.
Hey, Terri. Hey, Dan.
Hi,
so we're going to start. I'm going to start off, as I mentioned, by asking you to share a little bit about, who you are, where you're located, and what your organisation does. And Kat, I'm going to get you to kick us off with that info first.
I am happy to. So I am Catlin Moon. I go by Kat, and I teach at Vanderbilt Law School. I have a couple of titles. I am the Director of Innovation Design, and I also am the Director of the Poly Institute, and Poly is an acronym for Program on Law and Innovation. And all of those things happened at Vanderbilt Law School, which is a top 20 law school in the U.S. located in Nashville, Tennessee.
Fantastic. And Nashville's just beautiful as well, it has to be said. And Dan, thank you. And Dan, the same for you. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Dan Kayne. I'm the General Counsel for the Regions team at Network Rail in the UK. So Network Rail owns, maintains, operates the rail infrastructure in the UK, and I lead a team of about 20 lawyers who provide a very kind of general service to the business, a general legal support to the business. And I also, about 18 months ago, founded the O-Shaped Lawyer, about which we'll talk more now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump right into it and get into this whole thing around lawyer capabilities. And we've got a few slides that we're going to share as well. So folks that are listening to this on the podcast, you'll be able to see these. They'll be connected to the podcast when you click on them. And of course, to those that are watching the webinar, they'll be visible to you now. But I guess, what's kind of been an interesting, almost curious development has been how we're describing capabilities in terms of shapes. And there's been a few of them. We've had I's and T's and D's and O's, and it's probably as good a place as any to start with chatting about those shapes. So I'm just going to advance the slide to this first one here. And Kat, I guess you really have been involved with the Delta model, and I'm wondering if you could chat with us about, what motivated you to come up with the model in the first place, and how does it differ from the one that we've probably heard the most about in many respects, which is the T-shaped lawyer?
Yes, so the T-shaped lawyer is actually the slide on the screen, and I will start with talking about first, I cannot take original credit for creating the Delta model. So I do want to clarify, it came out of a design sprint that happened at Michigan State University. And while I am part of the working group and have continued to iterate it, so it's now like in version 4 or 5. And so I definitely have been actively involved in iterating and evolving the model. I do not want to take credit for the original creation, but I do know the creation story. And so I now collaborate with Allison Carroll, who is a professor at Northwestern And she was part of the original group that created the Delta. And it really evolved from the T-shaped lawyer, the image we're looking at. So the idea that lawyers do need this deep knowledge in the law, so the vertical part of the T, and then the idea, which is new actually to many, that there is this horizontal bar that sits atop the long vertical bar that contains competencies like data, process improvement, process design, and the use of technology, legal project management, those kinds of things. So the group in the original design sprint, when they were dreaming up the Delta, thought that there was an element missing from the T-shape. And it really is that human side of lawyering, which interestingly, when surveyed, most hiring lawyers will say that it is those very often hard to define and something hard to teach people skills that folks identify as being the most critical to your success in practicing law. So that really was the seed that was planted that evolved the two pieces of the T into a triangle with three sides, which is the Delta. And I think the next slide, shows the Delta model. And this is the current version that Allison and I have iterated, and we have identified the three sides of the Delta. The left-hand side is the people side, the right-hand side, process, and the foundation is the practice. So you could think of the practice, the foundation of the Delta, as the vertical bar in the T. And then the right-hand side, the process, would be the horizontal bar that was identified as part of the T-shaped lawyer description. And then we've added the third side, people. And we think that the visual model of the triangle, which Delta also represents change in the scientific world, right? So we view it as a very agile model that is subject to change in a couple of different ways at least. But by creating this triangle and situating these three areas of competencies equally to one another, we think it much more accurately represents how lawyers should go about viewing their own professional formation and development and understanding how these areas of competencies interact throughout our practice. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And Alice and I continue to work and conduct research and integrate existing research into evolving the model so that it can be as useful to people as possible.
And how important is it to kind of have that framework, Kat? Because you've mentioned that it helps guide people's careers, but presumably it helps people also guide them in their careers, right?
Yeah, so I think it does a number of things. If you would advance to the next slide, we've identified as an example some specific competencies that fall on the three sides of the Delta. And we offer this as an example so that folks understand first kind of the nature of the types of skills that fall on each of the three sides, even though we think it's pretty self-evident by the titles of the three areas. But what's really interesting about the Delta in helping guide people along their professional formation in the law, regardless of where they are, whether they are in law school or wherever they are in practice, is helping folks understand the nature of the role they're filling and understanding the competencies required for that particular role, and also understanding how the competencies on the three sides interact with one another and how a certain role may require emphasis on different sides. And I think the next slide evidences that and really displays that really well in a visual way. So we've given 4 examples here of 4 different Delta models. So these are 4 different areas of practice in which the emphasis of the array of competencies is going to shift based on the work you're doing. So there is no one single delta that says to be the perfect competent lawyer, you must have this array of competencies in this exact order and this kind of degree of competency. And so the invitation is really more to look, what is the work you're doing? What is the role you're filling? And what competencies on the three sides are most critical to your success and thriving in that role? And once you've identified those and kind of arrayed them on the delta, you can then understand where you spend most of your time in terms of the area of competency. So a solo and small firm lawyer likely is going to be doing things on all three sides on a pretty regular basis, in large part because they can't rely on a large staff that is going to be handling, for example, all the technology needs. Whereas if you are in a very large firm, let's say you're a second or third year associate, you're probably going to still be spending a lot of your time heavily involved on the practice side of the competencies as well as the people side, and likely aren't going to be tasked with as much on the process side earlier in your career in a large firm that has a lot of resources, that handles a lot of the data and process and technology matters for you. So, whereas, for example, if you are in legal operations or a legal tech company, again, your focus is going to shift. You're going to be spending less of your time in truly practice-based competencies and a lot more time in competencies that fall on the process side and somewhat on the people side. So our goal is really to show people that it is an agile model that is meant to help you capture what's most relevant for your role, and then help you, after identifying it, look for ways to grow in those relevant competencies as you develop and form along your career trajectory.
Kat, if I'm looking at this correctly, what you are saying, though, is that there's a need for a basic level of competency in all of those three areas, regardless of where the emphasis may lie in terms of the role that you do. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I think that one purpose is to evidence that there are competencies in all three areas that are integral and relevant. And so I think one value of understanding that is, as a professional, as you are gaining self-awareness and getting a better understanding of your own individual strengths, and also the work you enjoy doing, right? Like we all like some things better than others. Then you're able to hopefully be very intentional in identifying roles that you frankly might be better suited
Yeah.
or roles that you might want to avoid. But yes, regardless of the role, there is going to be a certain level of competency that falls on all three sides. We think that that is a pretty self-evident truth. But we also are not intending to dictate to anyone exactly what that ratio should be. And so in doing the research to understand what the possible array of competencies are, we have consulted decades of past research. The Carnegie Report in the U.S., the Foundations of Practice research that the Institute for the Advancement of the American Legal System, IALS, has done. Dan's research and the O-shaped lawyer heavily informs potential competencies on the people side, for example, and I think we're about to talk about that. So perhaps that's a good segue, but the goal is really, from my perspective and the work I'm doing with Allison, to try to amass all the good research. We've also conducted some original research and identify the array of potential competencies, and from that sift out, there probably is a pretty standard set that everybody needs to be working from that are kind of table stakes. And then what does that look like beyond that for your particular role? How deep do you need to go? What does that particular direction look like? And again, we just want to emphasize that will vary based on the work you choose to do. It's not a one size fits all delta.
But one thing's for sure, if you're sitting looking at the competencies that you had maybe 5 or 10 years ago, now would be a really good time to revisit them.
Absolutely. Well, and that's part of the agility and the change nature of the Delta, right? We want it to be a forward-looking model. So we are integrating research on cutting edge research on what do knowledge workers in the fourth industrial revolution need to know to be able to do to be successful, because we are knowledge workers. That's what the practice of law is. It is knowledge work. And so we cannot ignore the really valuable data that is being generated about that sector. Generally, we need to incorporate that into how we view and how we strive to develop our skills. And so that's part of our goal too. And that's the change nature of it. Forward thinking.
And the exciting part, I think, too, right? And I think if we're now kind of looking at the slide where, and Dan, I'm coming to you in just about 30 seconds, I think, but where it has a delta model, but it also has combined on this the T-shaped lawyer that we were speaking about and the O-shaped lawyer that we're about to come to. So, Kat, you see, if I'm reading this again correctly, that the Delta model really is complementary, but also perhaps underscores some particular elements that can be drawn from the other shapes, I'm going to call them for the moment. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we want the Delta model to be as holistic as possible, and it absolutely incorporates the work that has come before and is happening simultaneously. And so the work that Dan is doing with the O-shaped lawyer, I think, very readily informs how people should be viewing the skills on the people side and how they should be approaching their development of these important skills. And so I'm grateful to Dan for the research that his group is doing, because it helps us build out useful information for the people side of the Delta. And likewise, just to refer to the T-shaped lawyer, we view that the horizontal bar of the T as really being those skills that all fall on the process side. And so it absolutely informed how we identified those array of skills. But again, I think this shows as well that the Delta expands the T to encompass and include and give equal due and attention to the people skills, which the O-shaped lawyer is so focused on. So I think that's the nice holistic and collaborative nature of the model.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Dan, I'm just moving and bringing up now the O-shaped lawyer framework, and I wanted to pick up on something that you just said there, Kat. That holistic and collaborative nature, those I guess very human skills in many respects, just being underscored and so important, and not just in the work that lawyers are doing now, but I think also in the expectation of clients and how they're looking to their lawyers in terms of being their trusted advisors and or business partners as well, which brings us very directly to you, Dan. Hello again. And I was wondering if you could also just do a little bit of a deep dive into the O-shaped lawyer initially, how it came about, and then if you could just take us through this framework.
Yeah, of course. I must say, firstly, how delighted and privileged I am that Kat has been choosing to use some of the research. That's amazing. I didn't realise that, Kat. So I am genuinely delighted by that, and long may that continue. Look, I think we started from a slightly different place initially, but then our thinking almost completely converged with what Kat's been talking about, the development of the T into the Delta. I've been a lawyer now for 20 years or so. And I knew when I came into the in-house environment about 15 years ago, we found ourselves really up against a kind of perception, whether rightly or wrongly, that lawyers were kind of boxed off, that the lawyers were those you came to when the problem had got so big that you couldn't solve it yourself. So you came off and threw it over the fence to the lawyers, asked the lawyers to try and solve the problem, and then take the response and go off with it. rather than have a much more upfront partnership type arrangement between business and the lawyers with the in-house function. And that perception, I think, is largely unfair, but it's one that exists. And I've always been frustrated by it because I think it's a real blocker to the development of lawyers in-house. And just by way of example, there was a close contact of mine. He had started to run a project centrally within the business. He was the project director. I knew him very well. I'd heard about this exciting program. And I saw him and I said to him, look, it's brilliant that you're leading this project. I would love to be able to come and join you and do something with it. And he knew me well, and he still responded saying, look, we don't need lawyers on this one yet, Dan, but I'll let you know if we do. And I said, how about I don't do it as a lawyer? How about I just do it as a person? And, this is someone who knew me well, never for 1 minute felt that I would come out of that box that everyone believes that you are in and in it for a reason, partly because people either think, look, you've worked so hard to get somewhere, you've got the qualifications, why would you want to do anything like work as a project manager? Others just simply don't believe that lawyers have the capability and the skills to be able to embed themselves in the organization. So why did this lead to the O? Well, partly as a result of this thinking and how we engage with our internal customers within the business. I was talking about recruiting into our team, to our group general counsel, and I'd mentioned to him at the time the concept of the T-shaped lawyer. and Kat's helpfully taken us through the vertical and horizontal bars, so I won't go further into that. But I said at the time that it felt like it was missing something. It just didn't do what I felt we needed most. And that was to bring someone into the business who we knew would hit the ground running, would be able to build relationships with the business, build credibility quickly, and really just get it and work with. It's that element that Kat said, it's almost the intangible bit, that they just didn't feel that the lawyers we were meeting who came into the interview processes, phenomenally smart people, incredibly talented lawyers, and yet we just didn't have, for me, that bit that Kat mentioned around this intangible bit. That I didn't feel confident enough that I would be able to put them in front of the business. I said to my boss, I said, look, this T-shaped model is all very well. What we're looking for is much more of an all-rounder. We wanted a well-rounded individual. I said, alphabetically, that's more O than T. And that's genuinely the relationship between the O and where that came from and a T. And as I started to think about what would that O-shaped, well-rounded lawyer look like, that's where this initial framework came from, and one we still use 18 months on, which is to try and create a framework that's memorable, that really plays into what Kat was talking about, the people side of the Delta model, which, by the way, as you know, Kat, I'm a big fan of, and I think they are completely complementary. And this people side of it, for me, boiled down to some of the characteristics you can see here. And I'll take you through them, if I may, Terri, very briefly, because some of these have come from, these are skills. In some respects, I feel quite bad because they've come from almost the opposite of behaviors that I see in many of the lawyers that I've dealt with over the years, and said actually so much of that just wouldn't work. So take optimism as the first example there. We are, as a profession, trained to find fault. That's what we do. We're looking to be able to find the problems, and then we're able to try and help them get solved. But the problem I think we've got that creates is always looking for that thing that's going to go wrong often means our focus is on the negative and less on the positive. And there's plenty of good science around the idea that with optimism, it breeds optimism. It's very much something that people feed off, those who are optimistic around them. And we also would help us break down that barrier, I think, of legal being blockers. So that optimism was really key to this. Ownership is the idea that we can be much more accountable in what we do as lawyers. We tend to be able to deliver what we need to do. And in in-house law, it's so essential that you are taking responsibility and accountability for solving problems, not simply delivering legal advice and stepping back saying, over to you to make the tough calls here now, business. Because actually, if we're genuinely going to be part of the business, we need to be able to work with the business to solve problems and take some personal accountability. The openness is all around this idea of having a growth mindset, having a very open to learning new ways of working, learning new things, learning to work with a whole range of different people to be able to, again, deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. Whereas I think, again, in the legal world, historically, we've seen a lot of people come with a fixed mindset. This is my specialism. This is my focus. That's what I do. And all those other things you talk about, I just can't do them. And yet with an open growth mindset, what we do is we talk about, it might be you don't have those skills, but you don't have them yet. And it's something that can be learned. Opportunism, again, this really did come from experience of what I'd seen out in the market, where you hear a lot of lawyers saying, I've just not had the opportunity. It's just not been presented with the opportunity. And I felt very much that those who are successful, those O-shaped lawyers that I wanted to try and create, are people that went out. They seized opportunities. So they would look for them, they find them, and then they would take them. I think that our focus on technical excellence is something that is often, as I've said there, at the expense of business opportunity. And that's a real shame that we're not using the opportunities that we're presented with to help take our businesses forward. But again, we restrict ourselves to our areas of specialism. And finally, and possibly one that lawyers, I think, unfairly are often accused of, this lack of originality, creativity, innovation, however you want to describe it. But there's no doubt that thinking differently is going to play a huge part in how lawyers thrive in the future. And we've got to move away from particularly this, with all the challenges that we have in our profession around diversity and inclusion. We've got to move away from the idea that working in the same old way based on precedent is appropriate going forward. We need to accept that divergent ways of thinking, that bringing others into the conversation, will allow us to be more creative and original. And that really brings together where the framework came from. And where we took it next, Terry, was to take that to a load of GCs, 18 leading GCs we interviewed in the UK. And we kind of asked questions around this framework to them, and they produced what you can see here, which are the 12 attributes that we really distilled those conversations down into within those 3 buckets of build relationships, create value through legal initiatives, and be adaptable. And the interesting thing about those interviews was that, and the skills you can see here, nothing here will surprise many people who have been looking at change within the legal space for a long time. The idea of lawyers being able to communicate effectively and solve problems and be able to show courage and resilience, these aren't new things, right? That these are just things that exist that clearly general counsel in the UK don't believe are being done well enough. And they're seeing gaps that they think need to be filled. And just to kind of finish off on this, opening piece, it didn't surprise me, but it may be of interest to others. But when we asked the general counsel what they saw as good practice in the lawyers that they recruited or the lawyers that they hired externally, was very much a case of the table stakes Kat mentioned around understanding the law. That's your foundation. Then understand us and understand our business, understand our sector, the second block. But the third one, and perhaps most interesting, is this expectation from general counsel. They also need their lawyers to create value for the business. So no longer is it enough to be able to point out all the things that might go wrong and help mitigate. Now we want people to come in and help create solutions, help being able to almost identify the problems that we then need to go and solve. Problem finders and problem solvers. So I think that creating value is a really important piece as far as the general counsel we met concerned. And there's a whole host of other general counsel that we have spoken to throughout this program that I think is giving it real legs in the UK in particular. And of course, it's getting a global audience. Because I think what we're hearing is genuine, authentic GCs saying, look, we just don't get this right now. And this is something as customers of the businesses we work with, we really need this. So I'm delighted it's got the kind of attention it has. I think there's a huge amount we could do to move this from being a really good set of research into actually delivering against it. And And with this and the delta and the T, so many of the skills that we talk about are so important. I think it's incumbent on us as, if you like, change makers within the profession to actually go and deliver against that now.
Thanks very much for that, Dan. And I just kind of, as I'm looking at these attributes, and I'm going to call them the buckets or the categories in a way,
yeah,
it's almost like we're really now looking at, and drawing on what Kat was saying earlier, we're really looking at the foundation stones of legal practice, whether it be, in-house, or whether it be in private practice or wherever, that focus on adaptability and continuous improvement, that human element that we spoke about particularly here, but also from Kat, that building, the critical part of building relationships. And I guess a shift in focus to value and dare I say it, versus billable hours, just being so critically important as well. And so, again, I'm just going to say to you, do you think that's a fair comment that, in terms of what we saw initially and that you showed us, it was kind of almost like a mindset shift, as was Kat's, but these kind of become those foundational building blocks now to the way forward in practice. Would you agree with that?
I do. I think these are going to become essential. I think they already are essential. I just think there's a dearth of people who are being trained in this stuff. So none of this is easy. It's called the soft skills by many, but clearly we know that these are really hard skills to not only train and educate people in, but for people to have to practice it. And it does, like anything, like you learn your technical skills within the profession and you learn the law, you have to learn these things. And you have to learn these things by doing them. And I think to assume that, as it has been so far in our profession, which is, and I completely agree with Kat, this is a profession that dispenses knowledge, that these things have just been a kind of add-on or almost nice to have rather than mandatory. And I think that I'd like to think that these will become just as relevant in the future as the technical skills are currently regarded within the profession.
But both of your models, I think, are moving us from that knowledge base more into almost an applied and experience based, aren't they? Because, I think it's kind of like on the knowledge part, there's so much knowledge available at the moment.
Yeah.
You can type in pretty much anything into a search engine and you're going to be overwhelmed by the millions of responses. And to me, it's the critical part of what your models are saying is, yes, you've got that knowledge, but what we want to know is what you do with it. And we're trying to guide you with how to do that better. Again, do you think, and this is a question to both of you, do you think that's a fair comment?
If I go first, Terri, on that, I think it's fair. I think that our profession is a people business, and there is a service being provided. And unless I think we start to recognise that it is a service, it's not about being able to share how fabulously smart people are and almost go back to school and show them the workings. This is about being able to build relationships. It's about being able to work in a way that ultimately your customer or client wants. And putting the client first is something that traditionally hasn't been happening within our profession. It's been an afterthought. I think we're seeing that change now.
Yeah, fantastic. Kat, what are your thoughts about that? I know that you've got them.
Yes, I do. So I think the approach, inherent in the approach of the Delta and the O is a human-centered design approach, right? We are really thinking about how are we designing models that identify these core competencies and skills that are really at the center of the very human work that we do. And so I want to make a couple of points that come to mind as I'm listening to this discussion. So we are in the fourth industrial revolution now. And so it is a time of, such vast quantities of data and information that it's really head spinning. And we're frankly not quite sure what to do about it or with it, right? Especially in legal when we haven't really been data minded in a technological way. traditionally. So the scope of our knowledge, the pace of change, and then also the interconnectedness. So now we have this really interconnected global society, and I think we're seeing that as the evolution of these really huge global law firms continues to happen. So we have interconnectedness on this macro level and also on this micro level. So if we accept, and I think we must, that this rapid pace of change is with us to stay, and that technology is just going to become more and more relevant and at the center of not only what we do, but of what our clients do. I think that's a key point. Then I think we really do, it's imperative at this point that we really must look inward and focus on what are the unique human skills and human judgment skills that we bring that frankly differentiate us from machines that are more and more capable of doing a lot of work. People like to call it the low level work, but that low level work is really critical to a lot of clients. And so if we accept that machines really can do some things as well, if not better, I think it's even more imperative that we really focus on how do we identify and strengthen our unique human skills. And I think when you look at that array on the O-shaped lawyer, all of those individual skills and competencies fall very clearly on the people side of the delta. And by people side, I want to emphasize that the people, it's really the human side, in that we are focused on what are skills such as self-awareness and creativity, the things that we own, and also those skills that are all about interaction. So our ability to have empathy, our ability to collaborate, our ability to communicate effectively, right? So it's a very all-inclusive notion of people skills. And so I think that's what I think is one of the most interesting things about this time we're in, is that all this rapid pace of change and technology and amazing things happening really make us so relevant on the very human people levels. And that is why all the GCs that Dan has talked with care so deeply about those competencies that are arrayed around the O-shaped model, because that is what differentiates us, and that is our future. Absent those things, why do we need people doing these things? I mean, so I think, it's kind of the secret sauce.
It's interesting on that, Kat, because one of the things, sorry, Terri, one of the things that a lot of the GCs said when we were doing the interviews was that the transactions that they carry out, probably only about 10% of those transactions, or within a transaction, requires that brilliant top-level legal expertise. The rest of it can be done in a wholly different way. Now, that's a huge slice of the market that can be done differently. And that leaves you with that just pure excellence, technical excellence, is that little bit, the 10%. Everything else could be done in a wholly different way. I think that's fascinating and gives so much opportunity.
Yeah. And I think, to go to your point, Dan, the way that I've, or point you're making earlier, the way I have always thought about this is that there are, in any matter, it doesn't matter how complex, how difficult, there is always going to be a lot of lawyers that can help you with it. So why do you choose one over the other? And it's always based, like every other service, based on the relationship that you have with that person. And so I just, this aspect is just so critical to us going forward. Kat, I wanted to come back to you again, and I want to ask a similar question of you as well, Dan, because a lot of what you have all described is not tweaking at the edges. We're talking about systemic change, which is always obviously a lot more difficult to do. So, Kat, I wanted to jump first to you and your world, if you like, and kind of ask you, with the sort of things that you're talking about, Dan's talking about, and looking now at the typical law school model, if you like, and instruction that comes out of that. You know, when I was taught contracts, and it still now resonates strangely with me. I never actually saw a contract. And I'm just wondering, yeah, exactly, go figure. So I'm just kind of wondering, does it mean that we're having to go back to the drawing board in law schools now?
Yes and no. I'm going to give a nice lawyerly answer. So I want to start with a premise, and I think the truth that we are facing a existential crisis in the legal profession. So I'm going to refer specifically to the US, but I think these numbers hold almost globally, with a little variation. But in the United States, the vast majority of people who need legal help don't get it. Either they don't even enter the system, or if they enter the system, they don't get help from a lawyer. In the United States, except right now for one state, you, or maybe a couple, you have to be a licensed attorney in order to provide legal help. So this leaves, 80% or more of the people who have a need unserved. So that we have that challenge, right? We also have what I think is a crisis in wellness in the legal profession in the US. 30% or more are anxious, 20% or more are depressed. We have a significant problem with alcohol abuse and substance abuse. Our rate of suicide is much higher than the general population. So those are just two stark examples of how the way we've been doing things for more than 100 years, the system that arose out of the second industrial revolution, again, we're now in the fourth, everyone else is at least, that the tension between where we started and where the world is now is breaking us. And so from my perspective, this demands a radical redesign, frankly, to save us, to save the whole purpose of the profession, to actually serve the people who enter the legal system, and to uphold and support the rule of law, and also to maintain our own wellness so that we can do this important work. So I want to say yes, a radical redesign in a completely new way of doing things, I think, is fundamentally required. With that said, that does not mean that everything we do has to go away. We do some things really well in the US when it comes to legal education. And so I would view it as a foundation to build on, just as the practice is the foundation in the Delta model and the people and process are built on that foundation. I would say that we can build on the foundation of how we educate lawyers in the US. And we must build into meaningfully and holistically a concerted effort to teach what falls on the people and the process side. And I view this as a challenge, yes, but I like to flip challenges. It's the designer in me, and view them as opportunities. And so how might we, create a more holistic way of educating lawyers? And I think there are a lot of different ways to do it. And this is the final point I'll make, specifically when it comes to legal education. And again, speaking about how it happens in the US, we basically have one flavor. All law schools follow the same general curriculum dictated by the American Bar Association. Yes, there's variation at the edges, but it all happens essentially the same exact way. And there is no reason for that. I've already made it clear that people go on into the profession to fill roles that actually require different arrays of skills. And so why are we educating everyone as if they're all going to go do the same thing in the same exact way? Yeah. And so I think we really need experimentation and variation in how we can build new models for educating lawyers, so that we can create different kinds of lawyers. And I think that there's a fundamental need and a fundamental opportunity. And I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be in legal education, if some change actually happens. If it doesn't happen, it's an incredibly depressing time to be in legal education.
And it's our opportunity to lose, I think. and and it's an important one we don't, right?
I do. I mean, I think that the world around us sees these opportunities. And if those of us who have had this sole privilege for so long cannot wake up to the reality we find ourselves in and take advantage of the opportunity, it's going to be taken from us. Yes. And I think we're already seeing in the US serious regulatory redesign. I've got state Supreme Court justices from Arizona and Utah speaking to my students next week or this week, because they are changing the rules, and they are changing the rules to expand who can serve and how service can happen, because we have these needs to meet. And so are we going to be part of the solution, or are we going to let others solve these important problems because we are too stuck in our ways to evolve beyond the second industrial?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's when I say it's our opportunity to lose, to me it's kind of it's one situation. If you don't know that change is happening and you're not aware of it, it's quite a different one if you know that it's happening but you just can't get beyond yourself to be able to kind of do something differently. And I think that speaks also directly to the point that you made earlier, that if we are, for example, wanting the same model of people educated in the same way from the same law schools in many respects, how can we innovate in a world where there's no real opportunity for that? Dan, I wanted to come to you probably with two things. Firstly, to pick up a point that Kat just made about the need for change and the opportunity to be able to do that, because the UK legal education system in particular has just undergone, really, for those of us looking from the outside, a quite fundamental and huge change. How's that working, and how does it work in with the sort of things we're talking about today?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how it's seen as a fundamental change, because I think we seem in our profession to be so reticent about change that this is looking like a massive change. If you actually see what's on the inside of it, I think it's more like tweaking, frankly. And I am coming from a kind of slightly biased point of view, because I do think we need to light a fire under what's existed. And so what you're referring to is the solicitor's qualifying exam that's replacing our old legal practice course that's been in place for 30 years. And I think, frankly, at 30 years ago, that was seen to be something quite outstanding and creative, because it brought in a skill-based approach with negotiation and research, and that was kind of revolutionary at the time, rather than just being black letter law. I think this change that's been in consultation and in the offing now for at least 6 or 7 years is culminating next year, I think, in a program that is probably a diluted form of what already exists. And I think there are good reasons for trying to make it more cost effective for people and achievable, and that's great. And there's some real positives from a social mobility point of view. But I think what it's not doing is preparing people for practice. And that has been the concern that for so long practicing lawyers have had, as people are coming through the schooling system and landing in a law firm generally, because that's where the vast majority of lawyers go to qualify. They're finding a completely different world to that which they were expecting. These are people who are very intelligent, that have always been successful in academia, who have always got the top grades. They aren't used to getting things wrong. They aren't used to the idea that they are not the smartest people about. And so all of a sudden, they come into an environment that does require and demand different skill sets, that does require them to be able to understand that they're not always going to be right, that they need to understand that failure is an option. And for a lot of these people, they've just never seen or experienced that throughout the whole of their education, because they work in education in a very individualistic way, in a way that is very competitive against each other. And that starts to create all the wrong kind of messaging when people go into the real world. And to Kat's point, I couldn't agree more about the kind of existential crisis. I don't think there's enough being done, frankly, by leaders within our profession to address the well-being issue that we've got, to address the diversity problems that we've got. they are a huge amount of lip service is being paid to it. A huge amount of downstream kind of plastering over it is being done to it. Whereas actually we need to start to look much further upstream, understand why have we got ourselves in the position that we are in today, when all of the different elements that Kat described so articulately are very real every day for people living in our profession. We have the brightest, smartest people coming in who want to come into our profession to make a difference, who want to be able to thrive. And I think, unfortunately, too many end up just having to survive rather than thrive, or they go off into a different direction. And we benefit hugely from those that leave law firms and come in to the in-house environment, which, by the way, isn't perfect either. But I think that we are making greater strides into some of these really important areas that we've described. Just to try and bring this to a bit more of a head as to what's going on in the education system here. I think the fact that we're talking about change is great. I think the fact that we're going to go into a new era is great. And I also think that when you look at this profession as a system, which is what we have to start doing rather than at universities here, law schools, private practice, in-house teams, we look at it as an ecosystem, and you recognize that every single bit touches on each other. So when general counsel buy the services at law firms respond and they react, and they will do things differently if demanded by their client. Law schools, they deliver a product that law firms pay for. And if law firms are being asked to deliver a different set of skills, they can start demanding of law schools that law schools start to teach different skills. And therefore that will flow down through the whole education system here in the UK, through university, etc. So there is a real pressure, I think, a burning platform on the general counsel now to start to walk the walk. I think a lot of general counsel are fabulous potential change makers and do it in a very binary way with their existing law firm partners. And what we've tried to do with the O-Shape is start to bring that collective together and say, as a community, we have the opportunity to drive change throughout the whole system and do it through the law firms who carry a huge amount of influence and bring in a huge amount of revenue. They will then in turn drive that through the law schools. And the law schools, their appetite for it is huge. You know, we've already seen, working closely with them, that they will change their programs, those which they have some flexibility around rather than regulated. We've just introduced a first taster to the O-Shape lawyer program at one of the main colleges, the legal schools in the UK. The appetite is there. And I'm seeing that through so many of the people I talk to across the industry, that people want this to happen. And I think it's up to us, our type of community, to start actually making it happen, because otherwise we'll end up in this wonderful phrase that I've heard and always repeat anytime anyone gives me any airtime, which is leaders shape and victims grumble. And I would hate for us to be in the grumbling victim world, where we have an opportunity now, as you've both described, to shape. So that's what I hope we'll do.
I think that leadership aspect of it is just so critical, but also the integration aspect, because a lot of these sort of programs, particularly in law schools, but to some extent actually too in education beyond that, are seen as kind of bolt-ons and nice to haves. But really the sort of thing that you folks are describing is that it's an integral part of everything that you're doing. It's just part of how you develop or work or continue to thrive in many respects as a lawyer. And it kind of brings me to, unfortunately, the final thing that I wanted to chat with you both about today, and that is that issue of integration, because a lot of what you have both been speaking about is, you know, seeing legal education as a continuum. It starts somewhere, but probably realistically never finishes. But a critical part of that is bringing industry and law schools together and working much more closely than perhaps has ever happened before. And clearly you're doing that with your work, Dan, and with your work, Kat. But I'm just wondering if I may put this question to both of you. Where do you start? What is the thing that is, if you like, the spark in really getting meaningful collaborations off the ground. And Kat, from your point of view and looking at it from the law school point of view, how do you bring that collaboration, that critical collaboration together? Where do you start?
So that is a beautiful question. And I think it starts exactly with what Dan and I are both doing. So I want to emphasize Dan's point that we are talking about an ecosystem, right? We are talking about interconnected parts of a journey that a person goes through as part of their professional formation as a lawyer. And again, speaking for how things work in the US, that journey is disconnected. And so there is not a holistic approach that involves all the stakeholders and all the pieces and parts of the ecosystem that supports that formation. And so a primary purpose of the Delta is to actually spark this conversation. It is to put something in front of people that's very visual and easy to understand and clearly shows a relationship and the competencies, right? So it is something around which we can gather and talk about, and it is a starting point for the conversations. And I will say, every single person I've shown it to, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum of how badly we need to change things in the legal profession, because there are a lot of people who don't think we need to, right? And I've shown it to some people who fall on that end of the spectrum, and they look at it and they agree, this makes sense. I think it disarms the fear and the sort of challenged nature that some folks approach this conversation with, for good reason, right? We are talking about really upending the way things have worked quite well for a lot of people. And so I think that the Delta and the O-shaped lawyer, the models, give us something around which to gather and talk and start the conversation and then start to build action. And so that's our goal with the Delta, is we want it to operate as a tool that gives people a way to act on the information that we're sharing. And I want to point out another important thing that Dan said, and he mentioned our diversity issue. So that is really the third leg of the crisis that I think we're facing in the US. Right now, we have over 60% of the first year class at Vanderbilt Law School is women. I can tell you that right now, statistically, fewer than 20% of those women have a chance of becoming a partner, an equity partner at a big law firm in the US. I can also tell you that most of them come to law school believing that they have an equal opportunity to the men. And if you are a woman of color, your odds fall dramatically, much smaller than the 18% that white women have. So we need to fundamentally change as well how we are bringing people into and keeping them in the profession. And Terri, to your point, you referenced not only the education that happens in law school, but education, it never stops, right? And in the US, we have this really broken system of continuing legal education. So there's this opportunity to connect all these pieces holistically and do a much better job, right, of supporting the professional formation. And it starts with the conversation like what we're having right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, I'm going to you for the last word, unfortunately, again today. What's the spark?
You know, it's never going to be one last word with me. So I'll keep it as short as I can. Do you know what the spark is? The spark is this. I think also it does require people who have views across the full spectrum to start sharing and to be transparent about them. Because only by having the conversations, only by bringing together a whole range of different perspectives on this, will we be able to find a way forward that I think not everyone's going to be happy with, but at least it's much better than I think where we are today. So, you know, our vision of making the profession better for those who are in it, those who are entering it, and those who use it, is one that I think stands today as it did when we first set it out. We're testing this idea of collaboration around the O-shaped skills in real time now, in our practice element of what we're doing with law firms and in-house teams coming together in a psychologically safe space and using these skills to almost define how they do their work. And the early feedback from those parts has been incredibly positive, because what you're doing is you're giving people a voice. And our profession has always struggled with this idea of giving people a voice because it's very hierarchical. And when you have a very hierarchical profession, I mean, in the UK, we still talk about, I don't know if it's the same in the States, I don't know if it's the same in Australia, we still talk about people who are PQE, how many post-qualification years of experience? And how many other professions do you look at that go, I'm 7 years PQE, I'm 5 years PQE, therefore I have to look up to you because you're 2 years more PQE than I am. Notwithstanding, that might bear no resemblance on quality, on ability. It's simply a hierarchical system that we need to break down. So I think talking is essential. I think then the talking has to move into action, because otherwise we risk, and this is something I'd hate for the Delta model and the O shape and the T shape, which to an extent is already happening with the T, is it just gets confined to history. There's another great fad that came across and it just disappeared off with the rest of them. And in comes the M shape, the Z shape, whatever it is going forward. We've got to make sure that now that we've got this community of people that can see the perfect opportunity and timing for change. COVID, unfortunately, has brought home to roost the need for a human profession. If we don't do it now, frankly, we're just going to struggle to do it 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It's kind of almost serendipity that people like us are talking at times like this. I think it's incumbent on us now to deliver against that, because I know our networks are quite broad, and using those networks as a collective to drive change is essential, because it's a tough old profession to break down and to change. And you're talking about essentially a cultural transformation here. And that's going to be more of a campaign than us being able to just talk about a model. We've got to deliver against it.
Absolutely. And I guess, as a visual, I kind of see particularly the legal profession at the moment almost standing on the edge of the cliff. And in terms of the conversations, we shouldn't need any more convincing or any more conversations. We've got to be willing to jump. We've got to be that brave. And the two of you and the leadership that you're providing in that space is exceptional. And I thank you for it, as I do your time today. It's just been an amazing conversation, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people that will take an enormous amount away from this. And I know both of you are also open to those people contacting you afterwards if they'd like to continue the conversation. And we would certainly encourage people to, because we know that the conversation is critically important to have and to continue. So thank you very much again. To those of you listening, please do stay with us through LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, as the case may be. We like to continue these conversations, and I hope we'll get to continue a few more with you, Kat and Dan, as well. So again, thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terri.
Nice to see you both.
This has been awesome.
Cheers, Terri.